Hello and welcome to M07, Teaching Listening. Our question of the day today is, how do people improve their ability to listen in another language? Our objectives for today, you'll be able to differentiate between top-down and bottom-up listening and effective and ineffective listening lessons. And you will write appropriate questions for a top-down to bottom-up listening lesson. If you are only doing the video lesson, you do not have to do that. And you may recall some essential questions from the first unit that we're continuing to explore in Unit 2. What essential questions do we continue to answer? What does it mean to learn a language? So, is it about systems and skills? Is it about something else? Is it about interaction? Perhaps, how do we set up a listening lesson? How do we teach a language so that students can learn? What are the most effective best practices for teaching listening this week, reading next week? And how do we create a social environment where learning can happen? In other words, how do we ensure that interaction, input and output are happening in the classroom? In Unit 2, we have new essential questions that we begin to answer. For example, how do we support the development of students' language skills? We're actually going to get practice teaching input this week. And how do we develop their systems? Okay, so we are now teaching listening, lesson 1. On page 44, when is our next assessment due? This is an important question for all students. Our next assessment is coming up right around the corner. Actually, 2 weeks from today, M12, or 2 weeks from your next class, rather. M12 is your receptive skills lesson plan. How many assessments before the Meth 1 final? There's 2. There's the receptive skills lesson plan and the productive skills lesson plan. So watch out for those. Remember, the Meth 1 final is midterms in your other classes. So then we pick up the Meth 2 book for the second half. Your homework question number 1 asks you to look at the actful can-do statements. Interpretive listening is your ability, your personal ability to understand through listening. So what's your level? A lot of our students are in the intermediate high to intermediate low level. We have some novice highs that are perfectly capable teachers when they get out in the real world. This is a place for you to understand your own level before you can assess others. Very useful in your foreign language experience. Remember also that we improve listening by sequencing lesson components so learning can happen. And speaking of lesson components, they're always one of 3 things. They're either input, learning, or use, which we've talked about before. Is it something that they are just reading or listening to? Are they processing it as in learning? Or are they using it through some kind of meaningful output? So when should we activate student schema? In relation to input, should we do it during input? No, before input. So before that new input, you want them thinking about what they already know. That's essential. And that's your first micro-teaching. Keep that in mind. So from your homework, you have task 10.1, 10.2, and 10.3. And your job is to decide what's good about them and which one could be the best of the 3. If we look at the first one, it says, say to students, listen to this, play the recording once, and when you're finished, you quickly ask individual questions, and then you say, hey, you should have listened harder. What do you think about that one? Is it less effective? Is it less effective? Is it more effective? Is this going to improve their listening, and for what reasons? If you haven't done this, please pause and make sure you do the homework. now we're going to reveal, you'll see that actually when you think about this process, it's less effective because questions are given after the listening, so there is no reason to listen. The teacher says you should have listened harder, which is meaningless. They didn't know what to focus on. So it's kind of something else at this point, isn't it? Are they really checking listening at this point? Or is it checking something else when you say, hey, remember this stuff? What did he say at this point? What did he say at this point? That's not listening. That's checking something else. As a matter of fact, you might call that a memory test. It appears that they're not checking listening at all. It's just a memory test, not a listening task. Task 10.2, you could hand out a copy of the text of the conversation to all students, and then play the recording. And then when you're done, ask them the questions. So what do you think about that? Here we have, again, the questions are after. They also give that script, so it's less effective because the questions are after. And when you give students a written script, are they going to focus on their listening skills? No, they're going to use every clue that you give them. And that's what human beings do. We call that dual coding in some contexts. But in this context, if your goal is to improve their listening, you want them to focus only on listening. Okay? It's not about trying to understand through other means like reading. Okay, so this is not a listening task either. This looks like a different kind of task. It's a reading activity. If you give me listening in a foreign language and reading, my eyes are going right to that reading because it's easier. And the same is true of our learners. Okay, task 10.3. Give the questions to the students, play the recording, and then check if the students have found the answers. If not, play the recording again or scaffold the question, scaffold the task in different ways. And listen again. Well, we have two less effective, so what do you think about this one? Let's see, we have questions first, and then we play the recording, and then we check their answers. You guessed it, this is the most effective. The questions are given first, so there's a reason to listen, and the listening is played multiple times. How many times? As many times as they need it. And don't be afraid, they're not going to ask for it 17 times. Or if they do, they're in the wrong classroom. Usually twice or 3 times maximum, they'll get the gist and the detail of your listening task. So you see, you play it again, modify the questions. This is the best practice here. You could think of this as task before text, which is telling them what to do before they have access to the listening or reading text. Okay, next you're going to see a trapezoid of a listening text. You'll see this diagram quite a lot. You notice the overall shape here, from the general down to the specific. That's why it goes wide to narrow. At the top, we have some activating schema at the very top. Well, that's what we call background knowledge. It's kind of a better term. All right, there's 3 different kinds. If you notice, one of the kinds of schema is missing. We have background knowledge of the world and the specific topic, and that would be content schema, what you know about the world, and then background knowledge about the genre, which is formal schema, as you know. So the one kind of schema that seems to be missing is any kind of linguistic schema, which is background knowledge about language and languages that you know and that you bring with you to the text. Notice that all that background knowledge is actually floating above the text. It's not part of the text. It's in the learner's mind. And then when they get to the text, you see we have different aspects to focus on. From the whole text at the top, which is a very general idea, longer sections of the text, also top down, into kind of lower parts, which we'll talk about in a moment. So that top-down stuff, that general ideas, that's what we want to ask about first. We know that that's a good process for teaching listening. You also have sentences, which for our purposes are mostly about detail. they can get detail in the sentences. If they're longer sentences, there could be more information, but mostly details. Clauses, chunks, something like in front of the blackboard, something like Shui said in the SLA of phonology listening. Okay, so chunks of language that they memorize and use. Or even below that, we have, of course, words and the smallest thing, which would be sounds. Listen for, is it a present or past tense? Okay, here we go. So how do we listen? This is a passage which you should be familiar with from your Scrivener text. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so. Scrivener says that we need to talk about teaching the general idea, processing the general idea, and then listening for detail. If you look at that second paragraph, you can see, here's a reading task for you. There's one error. If you can find the error in the second part of this paragraph where it starts, when working on listening, if you can find the error there, that would be a bottom-up reading task for you. Let's see, something about former and latter is not right here. So I would encourage you to find what's wrong. And if you feel so inclined, leave a comment in your Google Classroom. What's the problem here? Former and latter. Interesting. That's just a little detailed reading task for you. If you haven't read this already, please do. I'll put the page number in the comments. So here's a task for you. More top-down or more bottom-up? More top-down or more bottom-up? Let's check out the different listening. Students use linguistic schema to recognize spoken words. So they're using the schema, but the key is, what are they recognizing? They're recognizing spoken words. So is that going to be a top-down concern or a bottom-up concern? Let's look back. Oh, there's words. Okay, so words are not going to be top-down. If you're recognizing words, that's a bottom-up issue. Okay. Number 2, students think about the mood of the conversation. So if you're talking about mood, that's kind of, what do you think? Is that a detail? Or is that an overall kind of tone? Sure, you can use certain words and certain pronunciation, and that can tell you if you're being sarcastic or being rude, right? Or serious or funny, but the conversation itself, now we're talking about a tone thing, which is top-down, right? What's the mood of this conversation? I hope it's not too serious and not too silly. All right, use the content schema to understand the situation. Again, you're using schema, but what are you understanding? Situation. And situation, as we know, is not going to be too detail-like. Situation is a top-down issue. How about listening for words ending with the S sound? There's a phoneme from SLA. If we're talking about sounds, is that top-down or a bottom-up? It's bottom-up. Okay. What if students find specific information about a speaker? Notice the word specific here. Specific information. That's bottom up. That's a detail about the speaker. The speaker mentioned that he was angry. The speaker mentioned that he was from Ohio. Okay, specific information. How about students identify the topic of the conversation? Topic should be a clue here. Okay, topic is a top-down issue. Right, so topic, it's the main idea. You could catch the topic in 30 seconds of listening. Students find the main idea. This is an easy one, folks. Students find the main idea. Main idea is a top-down. Top-down, it's a general concern. It's a general type of question. Okay. Students identify 3 reasons why the speaker is unhappy. Maybe the speaker is unhappy because she's tired, she's hungry, and she doesn't like you. Those are 3 reasons, and that sounds like not a general thing, but those sound like details. And your clue here is the number. Okay, when you see a number, usually we're talking about details. When you see the word specific, bottom up. Okay. Now, this is a T-chart you can make in your notebook. Could also be part of your simple task if you're doing this activity as a video lesson instead of the live lesson. Okay, so more effective procedures and less effective procedures. They're on the right. So if you haven't done this yet, please do pause the video and then come back and check your answers. That's the only way that we learn, right? Don't want me to just give it to you. Okay. And there they are. Okay, so more effective procedures for teaching listening. You focus mostly on comprehension of information as opposed to memorizing or just vocabulary or something like this. You can focus on other things. You can focus on vocabulary sometimes, but it shouldn't be the main focus of a listening activity. It could be a bottom-up task, for example. Okay, so you want to make sure that they're understanding. Use mostly real-life listening tasks. So real-life task would be if you're teaching Korean to a foreign person and you focus on how to buy food in the grocery store, not on the art of the Joseon dynasty. So something from their life that could be useful. Okay? That's the real-life listening task. You want something that they can use, something from the real world, in other words. You might have noticed that a lot of the tasks that we talk about, when we say give the purpose before listening, that's a best practice. That's what you want to do. You want to give them a reason to listen. You want to give them the reasons for the task. Let them know why they're doing that and what they should focus on. All of these things are going to help target their listening and it's going to help strengthen their listening if they do it again and again. And they're listening for different things, so they're practicing different listening processes, different strategies. If they focus on memorizing more than understanding, well, again, that's a memory task. And memory and listening are different processes. Memory is just, oh, how well can you remember exactly what you were told? And that's not very realistic either. Okay, so we want to give that question and purpose before listening. Sometimes we call this task before text. What about focusing on background knowledge before listening? Of course we should focus on background knowledge before listening. We've been talking about that since the first day of class. Okay, that's what we call activating schema, and that's the focus of your micro teaching 1. Before listening, definitely want to focus on it. And when we follow a top-down to bottom-up process, generally speaking, we want to move from the general to the specific. Now, the mind can go back and forth, and in fact does, but we know that this is a process that really helps strengthen our learners' listening skills and the strategies that they use while listening on their own. So get them to catch the forest and then the trees. And again, if we focus mostly on vocabulary, then that could be a receptive vocabulary task rather than a true listening task, because listening is about processing input, so it's about getting ideas more than just the words. Okay, and give them let them listen more than once. Absolutely, more than once, as many times as they need it theoretically. Okay, they should be able to do it in, like I say, 2 to 3 times, depending on what they're listening for. I would let you listen to 19 times to this video if you wanted to. I'm sure it would get boring after about the 15th time. Maybe the 3rd. Maybe the 2nd. Hopefully not the 1st time. Okay, let them listen as many times as they need to. So these are more effective procedures for teaching listening. Now, homework question number 6. You have some listening aims which we're matching to particular activities that are listed in your book. And what I'm going to do here, number 10 has been provided for you, and we're also going to reveal all these answers here. So if you haven't done this yet, please do it on your own, and here are our answers. Okay. Now, if you have questions about any of these, please do ask your teacher. It's okay if you have a few differences. Some of these are open to interpretation, but a lot of them are pretty clear. So ask your methodology teacher to explain why some of these are labeled this way. We have a bottom-up and top-down question type proposed procedure here on page 47 from Scrivener, a possible route map. Scrivener talks about how we can give students different kinds of listening tasks, how we could maybe have them do a gist listening for overview, so just a general quick listen, generally what's happening, without focusing on details, and you want to remind them just to get the main idea, so give them the question first. And Scrivener also likes the idea of listening for attitudes. So there's small things that can give us clue about attitude, right? So they could interpret intonation, paralinguistic features, size, but you kind of have to listen to the whole thing to get the attitude or the mood. So it's little things that give us a clue about the big idea. You have more careful listening for complex meanings. So maybe there's something that they want to fine-tune their understanding, as Scrivener put it. So maybe there's smaller parts of the text that they want to you want to help them to understand. And finally, there's some pronunciation or other awareness things that can help them focus on things. So perhaps find those weak forms, those contractions, or a certain kind of pronunciation that's interesting, or an area of difficulty for your learners. Distinguishing sounds is half of pronunciation, as you know from your phonology lesson in SLA. And your homework is your teacher will assign you either A, B, C, or D, and groups are announced in your Google Classrooms, or you can check the Google Slides for the live online version. Okay, so make sure you check that out for your groups if you don't know already, and these can be found in your student book. Fill out the analysis because you're going to talk about it the next day in class, and you're going to share with your groups. Okay, this is about all we have for M07. Thank you so much for tuning in, and take care of yourselves and your families. Oh, also please skim your Welcome Week packets before you take care of yourselves and your families. The full lesson demonstration of Bob wanting a raise, especially pages 32 to 34. It's a lovely Welcome Week packet. It's a beautiful thing, and you want to review because that was weeks ago at this point. Just have a quick skim of that. No task associated with that just yet. And your teaching listening questions, as usual, will be right there on Student Book, page 48. Now you can take care of yourselves and your families.